I usually start these podcasts by going back in time. I give you a date, we tell a story about something that happened in the past, and then we make a parallel to something that's happening, and then something we have a conversation about for about 40, 45 minutes. But I'm not going to do that today because I'm going to be candid with you. This is the sixth time I've actually sat down to record this podcast, and the reason because every time I do it, I feel like, no, it's not right. I don't feel like I got it right. I feel like I'm holding back. I feel like there's something else that I want to say. And I'm sitting here now. I've had a few glasses of wine. I'm listening to some nice music. I'm in the company of some very nice people who you may hear chime in from time to time if I forget something. We were having this discussion a few minutes ago, and I said, you know what, screw it. I'm gonna record it again for the sixth time because there's some important things to say, and I'm not gonna go back in time. We're gonna talk about right now, and the topic, what we're talking about, is gun control. It's the conversation that people are having right now, and I wanted to wait a little bit to have this because talking to somebody about gun control is like talking to somebody about religion, and most of the times people just don't want to hear it. They're so intransigent in their side. They're so consumed with their opinion that they can't, in many cases, completely incapable of listening to reason, even when there's perfectly valid and legitimate arguments that people make on the other side. And I'm going to start off by telling you something that you might actually be shocked from hearing, but from a personal perspective, me personally, I don't like the idea of a bunch of idiots running around with deadly weapons in their hands. I don't like it. My parents own firearms. They're probably listening to this. I don't like it. And I'll be the first to say, if my mother ever picks up a gun, the safest place to be standing is wherever she happens to be aiming. She can hardly see. She's not trained. She's about 90 pounds, soaking wet. I don't know that she has the strength, particularly for a double-action firearm. It scares the hell out of me to imagine my mother with a pistol, let alone something that's even bigger than that. It's like being on the road. I mean, anybody gets on the road and you think, God, there's a lot of idiots out there. I mean, I see this all the time. I drive in bizarre places all over the world, and there's just, God help us, there's so many complete and total imbeciles behind the wheel, and you probably saw a few of them today. In fact, in many cases, we're all part of that cadre from time to time, and we don't like it. Who likes being, on a road where there's some idiot with at the wheel of a deadly weapon? Nobody likes that. I don't like it. And it's the same thing for me personally with firearms. I don't like it. But you know what I like even less? I like even less the idea of my personal opinion becoming public policy. Just because I don't like the idea. I feel like, hey, you know what? I'm well trained. I'm tested. I'm responsible. I'm a person of integrity. I can handle a weapon. I can handle being behind a wheel without being a danger to society. I can handle having a firearm. I can handle having a deadly weapon in my hand and being trusted to use it responsibly because I have a lot of confidence in myself, but, I don't have a lot of confidence in most of those other idiots out there. But there's no chance that I would ever be comfortable saying, well, my opinion should be the one that makes public policy. My opinion should be the one that, government should listen to and say, yeah, that's right. Let's start having, screening and qualifications and all these sorts of things to make sure that, that my standards are the ones that become, this public policy. That's not only is extraordinarily arrogant, it's also dangerous. And while I don't particularly like living in a world where there's so much risk, I like even less the idea of living in a world where there's huge bureaucratic government committees that get to decide to take away people's freedoms and tell us what we can and cannot do. And we see this over and over and over again. That's not a world that I think any of us would really want to live in. And yes, it's a slippery slope, and I know a lot of people that are very, pro-gun control get tired of saying, I don't want to hear this slippery slope argument. So, let's kind of pause for a minute. And I'm going to have a sip of my wine. This is the 2013 Sovereign Valley Carmenere Vintage. It's wonderful. If you guys ever have a chance to try it. There are a lot of arguments on all sides of this where people that are very much in support of more gun control laws have this assertion. They say that gun control makes us safer. More laws make us safer. Fewer guns make us safer. And that is completely not true. But on the other side, you have people that say more guns make us safer. Fewer laws make us safer. You know? And that as well is completely untrue. The data that's out there doesn't support either assertion from either side, whether you're pro-gun or anti-gun or more gun control or less gun control. The data doesn't actually support either one of those. None of these assertions are actually supported by the data. And I'll give you a lot of examples. Caracas, Venezuela. Bogota, Colombia. Two cities I've had quite a bit of experience with recently. Both of these countries, both of these cities in particular, used to be known as some of the most dangerous cities in the world, particularly Bogota. And both of them enacted strict, very severe gun control laws. And what happened? Bogota became much safer. There's a drastic decline in violent crime, particularly in gun-related crime. Caracas, on the other hand, actually got much more dangerous. And today, Caracas really is one of the most dangerous cities in the world. So they both have incredibly restrictive gun control laws, and yet one of them got safer, and the other one got actually more dangerous. We see this all over the world. If you go to Europe, you can see a place like Bosnia, which actually has relatively liberal gun control laws, and in Belgium, that has very strict gun control laws, and yet their homicide rates are almost exactly the same. You get a place like Luxembourg, which has almost zero private gun ownership. If you look at private guns per capita, it's almost 0.0 in Luxembourg. And then you look at a place like Svalbard, Norway, in which they have almost no gun laws and a whole lot of gun ownership, and yet there's zero homicide. In Luxembourg actually has a relatively high homicide rate that's 9 times higher than in Germany, which is one of Europe's leading nations in private guns owned per capita. If you look in the United States, it's the same thing. You look at a place like Maryland and Virginia, which have completely opposite gun control laws, and yet they have almost exactly the same identical rates of gun-related deaths. Hawaii and Vermont, same deal. Polar opposite gun laws, and yet almost identical homicide rates. And so there's zero evidence for either correlation or causality for either any of these assertions. When people say, oh, more guns make us safer, or more gun control laws make us safer, those are completely BS assertions that are not supported by data, particularly when you look at a global and historic view. And there's a lot of evidence for this. And what's sad is that the President of the United States last week told the nation, he said, the data on this is very clear. No, it's not. The data is not very clear. The only thing the data is clear about is that it's very unclear. The data is clear that it doesn't support any of these assertions from either side. Anybody arguing about gun control, for gun control, against gun control, their arguments are not supported by data. And what's really interesting is that this same assertion, this conclusion, was reached by the U.S. government's own Center for Disease Control and Prevention, by the U.S. National Academy of Sciences, and there's a very interesting article I'd recommend you checking out in the Harvard Journal of Law and Public Policy called "Would Banning Firearms Reduce Murder and Suicide?" And this is an entirely objective article of which the authors came to the exact same conclusion as these, again, the CDC, this is a government agency, saying, look, we can't find any correlation or causality that more guns make us safer, that fewer guns make us safer, that there's any bearing or impact whatsoever when we pass laws, more laws, fewer laws. There's simply, these are simply not data-driven assertions. And the interesting thing that my very good friend here reminded me of, we have this discussion about tax policy all the time. And one of the things that I'm off to point out about the U.S. Tax policy is that in the land of the free, since the end of World War II, tax rates in the United States have been all over the board. They've had corporate tax rates, very high. They've had corporate tax rates low at 28%, if you want to call that low. They've had the highest marginal income tax rate as high as 90%. Tax rate been as low as 0%. They've had changes to state taxes and excise taxes. Every capital gains tax, every tax has been changed up to, from 0% to 90% since the end of World War II. There's been 7 decades of this. And yet tax revenue as a percentage of GDP has stayed almost exactly the same. There's been very little deviation in overall tax revenue. So the point is, it doesn't matter what tax laws they have. It doesn't matter how they change the tax rates. It doesn't matter. These things don't actually impact tax revenue at all. The data is very clear on that point. The data is very clear that when you change tax rates, you don't change tax revenue. And to me, it's a very interesting analogy. It's the same thing with gun control, is that when you change your gun control laws, it doesn't necessarily change your homicide rate. And if you take a worldwide look at this, or you take a historical look in the United States, you go back in U.S. history, you go back 200 plus years, and there have been all kinds of different policies and so forth related to gun control. The data doesn't support the assertions, any assertion. The data is just too broad. It's all over the board. It's not a tight shot group. But even still, both sides almost demand, that there's changes in public policy. They want public policy to change based on assertions that aren't supported by data. And right now, most of the gun laws in the United States are fairly liberal. In some cases, they're extremely liberal. And so the onus is, for people that want more gun control, they're the ones saying, hey, we need more laws, we need more laws. But again, the data doesn't support the assertion. What they call them common sense laws. I think most rational people, they say, hey, yeah, sounds great, common sense. Who can be against common sense? And one of the things they say is, we the royal we, need to keep, automatic weapons out of the hands of, the mentally ill. And that's an interesting statement to make. Because, for one, I would submit respectfully that there already are common sense laws on the books. Federal regulations bar people who are, who could easily be rejected based on criminal status, based on their mental health status, based on being dishonorably discharged from the military. If you renounce your U.S. citizenship, then you can be rejected from owning firearms based on U.S. federal law. In fact, U.S. federal law also requires that all firearms have a minimum level of metal content so that they can be picked up by metal detectors. Sounds like a common sense law. It's one that's already on the books. U.S. federal law has banned selling fully automatic weapons. This thing people always say, why do we allow people to buy fully automatic weapons? That's another thing that's already on the books. Fully automatic weapons have been banned for a very long time, and I think a lot of people don't actually understand the difference between a fully automatic weapon and a semi-automatic weapon. What a self-loading weapon actually is, and so forth. And then they always say, we need an assault rifle ban. That sounds like common sense, right? Why do people need assault rifles? Failing to recognize that 75% of all homicides, gun-related homicides in the United States, are actually perpetrated with handguns and not assault rifles. And by the way, that's not to say that assault rifles constitute 25%. There are a lot of other different classes of firearms that make up most of that remaining 25%. Only a very small portion of homicides in the United States of America are perpetrated with assault rifles. That's the data. And so once again, this idea of saying we need to ban assault rifles is not one of these things that's necessarily supported by the data. But it's hard to argue with this idea about common sense. Any rational person would say, I like common sense. But if you're over the age of 25, you may remember this as an analogy that goes back probably about 15 years. There was a company, a little-known company, obviously a very well-known company, called Enron. You guys probably remember Enron. Back in the late 90s, early 2000s, Enron was, God, it was just colossal. It made people so much money. If you invest in Enron, you just look like the smartest guy in the world. Because the stock shot through the moon, people made a killing, and everybody was wondering, how do they do it? Every quarter they were reporting record profits, more revenue, more assets. I mean, they were just raking in the dough. And people couldn't figure it out, but man, they were making a lot of people a lot of money, and then all of a sudden, they collapsed. And it turned out they just made it up. They just completely made stuff up. They've invented profits, they cooked the books, and just made it up. And the stock went to zero, they went out, threw a couple of guys in jail, and what happened? The government said, oh, we got to do something about this. We got to pass a law, because that's one of the only things that governments know how to do is pass laws. And I thought, this is one of the most ridiculous things they could possibly do, because it's not like it was legal. It's not like cooking the books and lying on your financial statements and inventing profits and conjuring revenue out of thin air. It's not like that was legal. Of course it was illegal. Of course there are already anti-fraud laws on the books. And it turns out, oh, by the way, there's also a government agency that's supposed to enforce the laws. It's called the Security and Exchange Commission, and it's supposed to be the watchdog for all of us little investors, who can't go out into the big bad world without the government looking out for us and taking care of us. And they were too busy looking at porn to do their jobs and make sure that Enron wasn't cooking the books, to make sure that Enron was actually following the laws that were already on the books. And so the government came in and said, oh, well, we're going to pass a new law. And so they did. They passed a new law to prevent fraud, and this law was called the Sarbanes-Oxley Act of 2002. And up until FATCA was passed just a couple of years ago, Sarbanes-Oxley was the dumbest law, certainly in U.S. financial history. And I'll spare you the inner workings of the Section 404 compliance. But yeah, it was just one of these things that completely turned off foreign investors, foreign companies wanting to have anything to do with the land of the free, because they thought, who wants to list on the New York Stock Exchange? They're going to throw you in jail. If my secretary makes a mistake on, in typing this up, if some idiot in the finance department makes a clerical error, I'm going to go to jail. No way I'm going to do that. And so it really reduced demand for investment, for public offerings and so forth in the United States of America because of this law. It was completely idiotic. And so this is the thing that happens, I think, when that I always think about when people say we need more laws, we need common sense laws, and I always just want to take a few minutes and actually really explore, well, what are the laws that are actually on the books? But to me, the bigger picture is, I don't think that a problem can ever actually be solved. And I think any rational human being has to look at it and say, this is a problem. There's certainly a lot of, murders, mass shootings, and so forth in the United States, more so than other countries. Why does that happen? It's a problem. But I think we have to really first, before you can solve a problem, you have to identify what that problem really is. What are we really talking about? We're talking about trying to save people's lives. And I think anybody can agree that when people die senselessly, that's a bad thing. And perhaps a little bit callous for guys like Jeb Bush to say, well, stuff happens. Well, yeah, okay, stuff happens. But, a lot of stuff doesn't necessarily need to happen. When kids get shot up in a school, that's not one of those things that needs to happen. And it shouldn't happen. How do you solve a problem like that? And to me, I think it's really a question of first saying, well, what is the problem that we're talking about? Because we're not talking about gun-related homicides. And if you look at it, I would actually argue that gun-related homicides in the United States of America aren't really the big problem. The government's own data shows that only 3.8 non-suicide gun-related deaths occur per 100,000 citizens. Road deaths, traffic accidents, for example, claim 11.6 per 100,000. That's over 3 times as many. So there's 3 times as many people die on the highway in traffic accidents than from gun-related homicides. Because the truth of the matter is that 75% of all these gun-related homicides occur in 5% of U.S. zip codes. And we're kind of accustomed to that, right? Because where do gun-related homicides occur? They occur in poor neighborhoods. Not in, upper middle class places, not in wealthy neighborhoods. They occur in poor neighborhoods. And they've been occurring for a really long time. And it's only when, some guy goes in to a upper middle class, predominantly white neighborhood that all of a sudden people lose their minds. Because as long as gun homicides take place, as long as they're only killing black people and Mexicans, then nobody gives a shit. But as soon as they come in, they start shooting up movie theaters where white people go to. That's when it becomes a problem. And forgive me for saying, but I think the argument's a little bit disingenuous because we're not talking about gun control. We're not talking about gun violence. We're talking about white people getting killed in predominantly, upper middle class neighborhoods. That's really what we're talking about. Because nobody really cares as long as it stays in poor neighborhoods. Nobody cares. And I find that whole thing to be a little bit disingenuous. And so the idea is now, that's when, so, again, soon as it comes into the upper middle class neighborhoods, that's when the President of the United States, the black president comes out and says, we need to do something about this, which is a weird thing to say when the president looks at citizens and say, we need to do something about this. And then when the Hollywood celebrities come out and they have public service announcements, they say, enough, we have to do something, we have to do something. And again, this has been a problem if you say, well, it's, gun-related violence. This has been happening for a long time. A long time. And nobody really cared before, but they care now. In the same way that, the President of the United States says that, we spend $1 trillion protecting people from terrorism. And this is one of those things that, people sort of been trained to be afraid of terrorism. And whenever there's a, if there's a terrorist attack, which is extremely unlikely, they occur from time to time, and people go nuts, and they get really afraid. And again, same thing when something like this happened, people go nuts, and they get really afraid. But when you look at the data, the statistics, 3.5 times as many people die in traffic accidents. There's more people die from type 2 diabetes, from heart disease, from all kinds of other things, as opposed to, non-suicide gun violence. And so the answer is to say we need common sense laws. Again, not bearing in mind that there are already certain common sense laws on books. It's not like it's not like federal law says, yes, we should sell guns to people that are mentally ill. That's already in the law. There are already background checks as part of the law. And I'm not saying they're great, and I'm not saying that they've obviously prevented all the, gun violence, but there's some interesting analogies. I would actually submit that that air travel is a rather interesting analogy. In 1969 alone, there were 40 attempted hijackings just in the United States of America. This is something that used to happen all the time. And a lot of people are too young to remember these days where, hijackings weren't actually that uncommon. They are today. You hardly hear about it anymore. Who hijacks a plane anymore? And because, there's a lot of measures in place. Of course, as soon as it started happening in 1969, 40 hijackings. Can you imagine? Almost every week. And then Walter Cronkite comes out and says, there's another hijacking today. A couple of angry guys took over a plane, and suddenly people said, we have to do something about this. We need to do something about this. And so they did. And they said, well, we'll start having air marshals. And that turned out to be completely ineffective because they realized, well, can't have one of these guys on every flight. There are too many commercial flights. So what do? They have bomb-sniffing dogs. And that didn't really do the trick either. So then we said, well, let's start interrogating passengers. And did you receive a package from somebody? Because of course, everybody that intends to, bomb a plane is going to say, oh, well, yes, of course I received a package. And it turned out that wasn't very effective either. And they started with metal detectors, and where are we at today? They body scanners, and they would after 9/11, what were they doing? They brought out the military and guys running around with their fingers at the ready, patrolling, airports in the United States of America like it was downtown Kandahar. Molesting children in plain sight, of their parents, and sending people through body scanners. You have to make the I surrender pose when you go in there. Put your hands up and stand there and get scanned and take your shoes off. And what else are you going to do? What else are you going to do? And it's still not completely effective. And you could point to it and say, well, certainly it's drastically reduced hijackings. There's certainly, again, correlation doesn't necessarily mean causation, but the correlation there is strong. The more these measures they've implemented, it's like they keep raising the bar on common sense. Common sense initially was air marshals, and it was bomb-sniffing dogs and so forth. Now common sense is apparently, well, you might blow up your underwear, so now you got to strip down. You got to take off shoes, take off your belt, got to take off all your stuff. And I always kind of chuckle because you can always tell the Americans whenever you're traveling, because Americans are so well trained now to start just like being in place. When I see these guys in Santiago, Chile, or in Bogota, or whatever, you can always tell which ones are Americans because they're the guys standing in the security line, taking off their shoes, taking off their belts, taking off their clothes, getting all their stuff out to put on the conveyor belt, and people are looking at them and going, "Why is this guy taking his clothes off? What kind of weirdo is this guy?" It's because Americans are so well trained that that's just what you do when you travel. That's not how most people travel. That's not what Chileans do when they get on an airplane. They don't take off their clothes. I remember standing in line behind this Chilean woman one time who was going to the United States. And it's so funny because when you go to the airport in Santiago and you're boarding a flight to the United States, you have to go through a separate security line. There's the line that everybody goes to where they're like traveling to some normal part in the world, and then there's this separate line that you have to go to if you're going to the land of the free. And they say, oh, you're going to the land of the free. You have to go through this line where you have to take off all of your clothes. And this is this woman's first time she's ever been to the United States, and she couldn't believe it. I remember saying, "Y zapatos? And my shoes too? Really? I have to take off my shoes?" Yes, you have to take off your shoes when you go to the United States. You couldn't believe it. You go to these other places, you don't have to do that. And yet, you don't have hijackings, in Chile. It just doesn't happen. And so again, I think you could look at that point and say, well, look at how safe air travel is in the land of the free. Because, they body scan people and they take off their shoes and they take off all their stuff and we submit to authority and you get groped and all this kind of stuff. I refuse to go through the body scanner, so I get groped. And I kind of enjoy it. Occasionally I chit-chat with the TSA agent. I'm always pleasantly surprised when one of them's like, yeah, this is kind of a BS thing to do. But yeah, sure, air travel is very safe in the U.S. There's very few incidents. But they don't do this stuff in most places in the world. And guess what? There's very few hijackings in Latin America as well. Wow, what a surprise. Maybe there's just something else going on. Maybe there's something else going on, with gun violence as well. Maybe there are other factors at play. And so it's like this idea of, well, let's have common sense laws. Again, the idea is, well, let's save people. And I always look at that and say, well, so what's the idea? We need to make sure, we need to pass a law and make sure that no crazy people can ever get their hands on a gun. That actually sounds great, right? Let's wave a magic wand and make sure that no crazy people can have weapons. Well, I ran out of magic wands. I don't know about you. I think Barack did a long time ago. I don't think he's got a stash of magic wands anywhere. And so, what do? They have to pass a law, and they did it, and it's like, either have some half measure that does very little, or you go all the way, you go full Monty, and you start having psychological examinations, which, by the way, they do in certain places in the world. They do that in Chile. In Chile, there's part of the rule, if you want to get a permit to own a firearm, you have to go through some psychological evaluation. And I'm here to tell you that guess what? A couple of $100 later, you don't have to worry about that requirement. And suddenly you've got a brand new weapon in your hand and you've never taken a psychological examination. You haven't gone through the permitting process, because there's always ways around any law, every law. There's always ways around these things. And so they're certainly they're ineffective, but it raises the question. They say, well, even if it saves, one life, isn't it worth it? Okay, yeah, great. Maybe it's not super effective. Maybe it's not going to eliminate all the problems. But isn't it worth going down that road if you can at least save some lives? If there are some children that don't die because, we took some steps? And sure, that sounds great. Wow, of course. Who wouldn't be willing to, take a little bit of action so that, some people might be safe, some people might be safer? But this is where we get into the cold calculus of bankruptcy. And I'm talking about the United States in particular, and there are a lot of countries around the world in this boat, but the debate happens to be taking place central in the United States. The United States government is flat broke. Flat, entirely, completely broke. Not my statement. Their own financial statements tell you that. They're $18 trillion in a negative equity position. What does that mean? It means if you add up every penny, every dollar they have in the bank, if you add up the value of their land, if you add up the value of every tank and bullet and fixed asset that they ever spent money on, and all of Obama's jets and limousines, and you added all those assets up, and you subtracted just their official liabilities, you end up with a net worth of the United States government of negative $18 trillion. But there's more than that. Because then you start having to look at unfunded liabilities. How much do they owe to the retirees of the United States of America? How much in the hole are they with Medicare and Social Security? Their own estimates, once again, if you Google, I encourage you to do this, Google financial statements of the United States government. And there's a department within the Treasury Department, there's an agency within the Treasury Department that actually publishes these. And you can read it for yourself. And it's right there in plain English for anybody that gives a damn to actually look at any of this information. Their own estimates of their unfunded liabilities are $42 trillion. You add the two together, you're talking about minus $60 trillion. That's $200,000 in the hole for every man, woman, and child in the United States of America. This is not a government that is awash with cash. This is not a government that is awash with financial resources. Now ask yourself, regardless of how you feel, how much time and energy and resources and money is it going to take to pass really almost any gun control, particularly meaningful gun control? How much lobbying, how much campaigning, how many public service announcements have to be run to get people, on board with this? How many congressmen have to be bought off in order for them to vote on this? You know, how much does the NRA have to get paid to not challenge it in court? I mean, it would cost so much money to do that. And when you think about it, then you look at it and say, okay, how many lives can we save for all of this money that we have to spend? Is it worth it? I would say if your goal is really to save lives, if you take the emotion out of it and say, we have to save white people, we have to make sure that Starbucks and predominantly white neighborhoods don't get shot up. Say, no. If the goal here is to honestly say, let's save people. We need to save lives. If you start with, by the way, this completely bullshit premise that it's the government's responsibility to save lives, to protect people, but it's just completely not true. But even if we assume that that's true and say it's the government's responsibility to protect people and save lives, then say, okay, let's look at every single thing out there that where there's a measurable death rate: diabetes, heart disease, terrorist attacks, getting shot up by lunatics, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Brain tumors and sniffing paint and whatever. Everything out there where there's a measurable death rate, and put it on the table and say, okay, how much will it cost us to fix this? And how much will it cost us to fix that? And how much will it cost us to cure diabetes? And how much will it cost us to reduce traffic accidents? That, by the way, causes 3.5 times as many deaths as gun-related homicides. How much will it cost us to drastically bring these down? Where can we get the most bang for our buck? Because we don't got a whole lot of bucks. There's not that much money in the United States government. They're in a negative equity position, minus $60 trillion. How much money can you afford to spend to save lives when you're $60 trillion in the hole? But if that truly is the goal, if you're a humanist and you think, I want to save lives, then the rational, completely objective thing to do is to take the whole cold, hard calculus and put all the measurable death rates on the table and say, where do we get the most bang for our buck? If we're going to spend $100 billion on something, where do we get the most bang for our buck? The President of the United States was almost proud when he told people, we spent $1 trillion on saving lives, on protecting people from terrorist attacks. What in the world is the likelihood of somebody getting killed in a terrorist attack? Yes, they happen from time to time. Well, there might be one that happens tomorrow. God, I hope not. It might happen. But if it does, then the number of terrorist-related deaths will still pale in comparison to the number of people that fall and die in the shower. And so if you put all that on the table and you say, wow, we spent $1 trillion to save people from the prospect of death that's so small, they'd probably be more likely to get struck by lightning. And we spend $1 trillion that we don't have to protect people from a likelihood that's about the same as getting struck by lightning. Now we can spend another however many billions, tens of billions, hundreds of billions of dollars to protect people from something that A, won't hardly be very effective, but B, is less likely than getting killed on the highway. And how much sense does that make? Not a lot. If the idea is common sense ways to protect people, I think it requires a cold, hard look at the data that, by the way, doesn't support any assertion, and B, a very rational calculus to say, okay, great, let's save lives. Let's pretend that, it is the government's responsibility to protect people, which it's not. I'm sorry, but I'm a grown man. I'm almost 37 years old. I pretty much feel like it's my responsibility to protect myself, to defend myself, to protect the people that I love. That's my responsibility, not Barack's, mine. But even if we assume that to be true and say, all right, it's Cousin Barry's responsibility, let's let this guy protect me, do we really want to spend $1 trillion to save people for something that's it's a likelihood that's so infinitesimally small, it's practically zero? Does that really make sense? Does it make sense to spend $100 billion on that? How much cancer can you cure for $1 trillion? How much diabetes? How much heart disease? How many traffic accidents can you prevent with $1 trillion, with $100 billion? How many of these things can you prevent? Hell, with $1 trillion, I could probably develop some technology where there's some bulletproof clothing that people can wear, it probably costs a hell of a lot less than, than most of these measures that people are even talking about. I'm not even saying that's the answer, but my point is that when you take a hard look at the data and do the real math behind this, it just doesn't add up. What was interesting to me is that, as my friend here reminded me, a couple of days ago when I was I was actually in Medellin. Beautiful place. I really recommend people check it out. Oh, is it wonderful. And I was with some friends, and we're driving up into the mountains, way up in the mountains, and one of the nicest places I'd seen. And the infrastructure right now in Colombia in general is very poor. And, why would anybody have invested in Colombia? Why would anybody have invested in Colombian infrastructure? Because, they were dealing with these, these guerrilla groups and mafia and terrorists and so forth for so long. They knew, man, if we could spend $1 billion on infrastructure, and as soon as we do, people are just going to go blow it up. So why bother? And so here they are now, years later. They've got peace. They've got, budding prosperity, and now they're going to spend a ton of money on infrastructure. They're going to build a huge road network. It's going to be great. But for right now, going up into these mountains is a very treacherous road, twisting and turning and winding, and there's hardly 10 meters of visibility. You can't see around any curves. And, in Colombia, people just, you could imagine being behind this long train of vehicles because there's some huge truck, trying to go up this mountain road, and he's going, 10 miles an hour, and you're in a hurry, and you're like, man, I can't wait for this. And so what do people do? Of course, they dart into the no passing zone. They dart into the other lane in a no passing zone where they have no visibility. They can't see the oncoming traffic because they're going around a steep curve, and splat, people die. Every day this happens all across Colombia because people lose patience. They don't want to wait behind the big truck, whatever. And so, yeah, they're building, more roads, but right now the roads suck, and this is the reality. And people die all the time. I saw one of the most interesting things I'd ever seen in terms of, death prevention, accident prevention. We're on this kind of long straightaway going up to the mountain road, right before all the twists and turns started. And there were a bunch of cars there, and we turn and we see in the distance looked like people. They were wearing bright red. We got a little bit closer. We saw there was a bunch of women wearing bright red. We got even closer. It turns out they were gorgeous women. Just gorgeous women, and they were stopping all the traffic. Who's not going to stop for that? And so we slowed down, and we kind of slicked back our eyebrows. We're like, hola. And, we roll down the window, and these girls start talking to us, and they're saying, hey, I just want to let you know that, this road is really dangerous. And, you might be going up the road, and you might get stuck behind a truck, but you might be tempted to swerve around the truck and come into oncoming traffic and try and pass the truck, but I just really hope you don't do that. It's really dangerous. People die on this road all the time, and to be honest, even if you race up the road, it's only going to save you about 5 or 10 minutes, and it's probably not worth it. And it'd just be really cool, and I'm just, I'm asking you if you just please wouldn't do that. And I was floored. I'd never seen that before in my life. They gave us a little piece of paper, almost like as a reminder. This is something kind of in in psychology. It's like you sort of take something from somebody as a memento. It's like now I'm agreeing with you, and and it was a very common sense thing. And it's like instead of some cop there, standing there in his uniform and peacock strutting with a radar detector, waving people down, they just had these like very pretty girls making a rational case, asking people very nicely, hey, it'd be really nice if you would slow down. And just, just take your time. It's cool. And, it's a nice view. Just enjoy the drive. It's pretty up there. And so sure enough, my friend was driving and we're going up the road and we got stuck behind a truck, and I looked at him and I could see the wheels turning in his head. I could see the instinct, his sort of man instinct, wanted to swerve around this truck and past the truck, and he didn't do it. And it worked. And I thought, is that genius? And I started wondering, how much did that cost? A couple girls standing on the road to ask people nicely to slow down? Probably doing it as part of a volunteer effort. I don't know. But I mean, it can't be that expensive. And I started thinking about that. I said, how much bang do you get for your buck for that? No pun intended. Oof. But I mean, how many lives get saved for, a tiny investment in hiring a couple people to stand there and ask people nicely, hey, would you mind slowing down? It's very dangerous up there. I mean, and it's this sort of sense of community you get, and kindness and so forth, or you can spend $1 trillion, molesting children and sending people in the I surrender pose and creating a police state to prevent, a death rate that's probably about as likely as getting struck by lightning. On what planet is that common sense? It's not. It's really not. And again, it's like it's one of those things I think that requires this cold hard calculus. It requires looking at the data. It requires taking a realistic approach and saying all these rules can be skirted. And I think, by the way, in the case of of airplanes, you start looking at cultural and says, yeah, sure, there are fewer hijackings than there used to be. I would actually respectfully submit that people that were crazy, people that were just batshit crazy and said, I'm going to blow up an airplane. Well, I can't do that anymore. It's a lot harder. I'm just going to go find another outlet. And maybe that outlet was grabbing a weapon and going and blowing people up because they were racist, or because they didn't like Christians, or because, I don't know, they were just crazy. And so they started shooting people. And maybe that became their outlet. Or maybe they couldn't get their hands on a gun. So they got their hands on fertilizer and they blew up a federal building. Or they got their hands on a pressure cooker and blew up people at a marathon. And so what do? What's the common sense law? Well, we got to ban pressure cookers now. You buy too many pressure cookers, you're a terrorist. It's like now you can't walk into a pharmacy in the land of the free and buy too much Sudafed, otherwise they think that you're running a meth lab. And that's the reality. And is that common sense? Again, for me, look, I'm a rational guy. And I honestly don't like of course I don't like the idea of a bunch of idiots walking around with deadly weapons. I don't like the idea of a bunch of idiots being behind the wheel of a vehicle. I don't like the idea of idiots being in charge of the financial system. I don't like the idea of idiots running countries. I don't like the idea of any of this. But I don't get to wave my magic wand and say, here's what the world's going to be according to Simon Black, nor do I have that kind of arrogance to say, I think everybody should live the way that I expect them to live. That's extraordinarily arrogant. There's no doubt that everybody wants the world to be safer. But the bottom line is that there's just no simple answer to this. And again, a lot of this starts with this premise, I think, which is a flawed premise, that that the government is responsible for our safety, and they're not. The government's not. You're responsible for your safety. I'm responsible for my safety. We can be responsible for the safety of the people that we love. But instead of sort of attaching assertions that aren't supported by data and demanding that they become public policy because we're afraid, I think there are better options out there. And again, they might be uncomfortable to say, let's take a cold, hard look at the calculus. Let's take a cold, hard look at the data. What is it about the United States, by the way, that makes people so completely crazy? The President of the United States said this last week. He said, you know what? People always say we need to focus on mental health, as if the United States is the only country with mentally ill people. Of course that's not true. Of course the United States isn't the only country with mentally ill people. This is, the President of the United States saying this. He said the U.S. isn't the only country with mentally ill people. The U.K. has mentally ill people, and they don't have these kinds of issues. Because why? Because they have gun control. Well, what's kind of funny about that is a couple things. One is that, I don't know if we mentioned this earlier. The UK had gun control. The UK had a lot of mass shootings. They imposed gun control, and their violent crime rate went up. And Australia had the exact opposite effect. They had mass shootings. They imposed gun control, and Australia, violent crime went down. Again, not necessarily causation, not necessarily correlation. But in the case of the UK, say, okay, sure, the UK has mentally ill people as well. And they don't have these kinds of mass shootings. I decided to pull the data. In the UK, 1.7 million people, according to their own National Healthcare Service, sought out treatment for mental illness. And this was, I don't have the data right in front of me, but I pasted this number in. I'm sure you can look it up yourself. This was within the last couple of years. 1.7 million people in a single year. And that's about 2% of the population in the United Kingdom. According to the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, in the land of the free, it was 63.3 million people, which is 20% of the population. So we're talking less than 2% seeking treatment for mental health. By the way, in a country where it's, quote, free to go and get to go and get treatment because they have national health care. So the barrier to going out and seeking treatment is very low. So certainly the financial barrier. In the United States, 10 times as many people as a percentage of the population were seeking mental health treatment, where there is actually a high barrier, a high financial barrier to go and seek treatment. Now, what does that tell you? And by the way, the numbers are similar across a lot of other places in the West. Canada, Australia, and so forth. All these numbers are less than 10%, 7%, 5%, 3%, 2%, 1%, 20% in the United States. So while the President of the United States is correct in saying the U.S. isn't alone in having citizens that are mentally ill, yes, that's correct. But there's 10 times as many people as a percentage of the population as in the UK. I think that bears a little bit of analysis. What is it about the U.S. that makes people, that creates the conditions for mental illness? And look, a lot of people I'm not here to tell you, by the way, that people who are mentally ill are crazy or are going to go shoot up a bunch of people in a movie theater. Mental illness affects a lot of people, and depression and all these things. I mean, these are bad. And there's a lot of people that are suffering, and they're not violent. They don't have violent tendencies. They're suffering and they need help, and it's terrible. But certainly there are people that go so far, and their mental illness is so extreme that yes, it does create some tendency to make them want to do something. Or maybe there's something in the United States that takes people who are mentally ill and certain people and a certain subset of that and leads them into violence. Maybe there's some glorification of violence. Maybe there's a desensitization of violence. Maybe there's a cultural history of violent crime in the United States. Maybe there's a lack of connection to humanity that desensitizes people to killing one another. I think people in the U.S., we're getting in a position in society. I don't know why I'm saying we. I'm not even there. People in the U.S., people have Facebook friends instead of real friends. They swipe right on Tinder and look at porn instead of having actual meaningful relationships with people that they love. People go into debt to buy stuff that they don't need so that they can keep up with people that they don't even care about, keep up with a neighbor that they probably never even exchanged words with ever. Sitting in traffic for more than just about anybody else in the civilized world, going to a job that they probably hate, working for some asshole that they don't like, so that they can continue to go into debt, that buy more stuff that they don't need, so that one day they can retire fat, bloated, unhealthy, and take all the money they made to get unhealthy and trade it for more health. They can pump themselves full of medication and think about all the things that they were never able to do. Physically, Americans are already some of the least healthy people in the world. There's a higher prevalence of type 2 diabetes, heart disease, obesity. It's not too far of a stretch to think that maybe Americans have higher levels of mental illness. And there certainly is some data to reflect that. I think that certainly bears a little bit more analysis. There's something that's messed up. I'm not here to to say that that I've cracked the code. I'm not saying that I have the answer. I certainly don't. But again, if you look at what's really happening, there's got to be something else going on, because the data about gun ownership, the number of guns and gun control laws and all these sorts of things don't support any assertion on either side of the debate. So there have to be other factors. There's got to be something else. And if you take that in consideration and you actually ask yourself, what's the real problem we're trying to solve, and you're really honest with yourself about what the problem is you're trying to solve, and you're really honest with yourself about this idea of saving lives, and whether that's even the government's responsibility, which it's not, by the way, it says nothing in the Constitution about the government being responsible for saving lives. Look in the preamble. There's nothing in there to say, oh, we're here to save lives. There's nothing in there. There's nothing in the President of the United States oath of office. Every time the President says, it's my number one responsibility to save lives. No, it's not. The President of the United States swears to support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic, to bear true faith and allegiance to the same, and that he takes this obligation freely without any mental reservation or purpose of evasion, and that he will well and faithfully discharge the duties of the office upon which he is about to enter, so help him God. That is the oath that he's about to take, that he takes. It has nothing to do with saving the American people. And in my view, I think that the sooner people start looking at all of these together, the cold, hard calculus about saving lives and where they get the most bang for their buck, where they get the most return on investment in a country and a government that is $60 trillion in the hole, I think that's probably the most rational way to go about looking at this, at this issue. It's a horrible issue. It's horrible that it's even necessary to even talk about this. It's horrible that that people die, that children get shot, that innocent people are sitting there enjoying a steak and a coffee and a movie, and the next thing there's bullets flying. It's a terrible, horrible thing. And what's even worse is there are a lot of terrible, horrible things in the world. And that a lot of people die senselessly, and it's terrible. And I think it's insensitive to say. I think it's insensitive to say stuff happens, just like I think it's insensitive to, for what's his name, presidential candidate, I don't even, Carson, saying, if I were there, I would have tackled the guy. I mean, this is such nonsense. I'm sorry. And you hear this a lot, I think, as well, from pro-gun guys who say, well, if I was there with my gun, I would have shot him up and tackled him and so forth. If you've never shot at another human being or been shot at, you just don't have any business saying stuff like that about how you would act in that situation and so forth. I mean, this is like high school, jock, locker room conversation. It just doesn't have any business being anywhere near this debate. And I guess that's where I'll really close and say it's a debate. And it's a visceral one, and it's one of those things that you get two people on two opposing sides, and they just kind of scream at each other, not really listening to anything that's rational. At the end of the day, everybody wants the same thing. Everybody wants to be safe, and people agree that when children die at the hands of some crazed lunatic, that sucks. And of course, people feel like, there's got to be something we can do about it. I would only encourage people, and I don't have the answers, and I think anybody that claims to have the answers is just full of it. The one thing I would really say, though, is like anything, take an incredibly rational, sobering view at what the real data actually says, and come up with your own analysis and decisions accordingly. Thanks very much for listening, guys. This was number 6. I'm not going to record another one. I think I said everything that I had to say on this, so I'm going to go enjoy the rest of my wine in the company of my friends, and we'll talk to you again soon.